Hi, my name is Lisa Jarrett. I am Assistant Professor of Community and Context Arts at Portland State University School of Art and Design. I am here today with my colleague Darrell Grant, and Darrell is a jazz musician, composer, and also a professor of music at Portland State University School of Music. We are on site at KS MoCA, or the King School Museum of Contemporary Art, which is a contemporary art museum inside Dr. MLK Jr. School in Northeast Portland. I'm here today to talk to Darrell about his new opera coming out this spring, actually in April. It's called Sanctuaries. And Darrell, I just want to open up by asking, what is Sanctuaries to you? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. Almost 3 years ago, I was approached by Third Angle New Music, interested in doing a collaboration, and we had a lot of discussions about sort of, well, what would you want to do? And sort of, Third Angle New Music is a contemporary music presenting organization that both commissions work and presents national and international performers here in Portland for a range of sort of contemporary classical and music that goes beyond sort of genre considerations. And so, we talked about it, and the subject of chamber opera came up. And I remember somebody just brought it up, and I was like, what? Like, why would I even think about doing that? But the more I sort of turned it over in my mind, the more I thought, well, why wouldn't I do that? And that became the more interesting question. What is it about that genre, or that word, or that sort of image of that art form that made me feel like an outsider? And as I started to examine that a little bit, I started to wonder, is there a possible way for me to bring who I am, a jazz musician, improvising musician, African-American performer, composer, to that genre in a way that feels really authentic and meaningful? And so Sanctuaries sort of became the outgrowth of that exploration. Basically, music, the creation of art becomes an excuse to do a deep dive into some issues of cultural importance. And so what if we look at this sort of history of the African American community here, and this history of gentrification, and looking beneath it into urban renewal and redlining and this sort of systemic and historic oppression of African American populations here, and so Sanctuaries became an excuse to sort of explore that and see if there's a way to bring that into the art world that I live, and with the influences that I bring with jazz and improvisation and vernacular music and culture.
I'm really interested in that idea of the chamber opera and your initial resistance maybe to the form. And then in reading about the project and learning more about the work as you've been developing it over the past few years, there was a quote that came up from one of your colleagues, your collaborators, Alexander Gideon, who said, "We're unflinchingly calling it an opera. People will have to unpack their resistance to this." Right. And it made me think about the relationship that you all as artists and creators may have initially had to that idea of a chamber opera, and maybe what changed for you over time in developing the work. So what was it about the form of opera that made Sanctuaries kind of manifest in that way, as opposed to an improvisational jazz piece or any other style of working?
Well, I think the idea that opera is a medium for sort of storytelling writ large, because it combines, like in real time, all the drama and literature and music and stagecraft and art. I mean, it's the medium that sort of ties all these things together. And what was daunting about it is that most of the time the stories that is applied to are based in Western European cultural history. And more recently what has happened is that more and more operas, contemporary opera, has started to deal with stories that don't come from that. I mean, whether it's Greek myth or Roman myth or Western European stories, or even the Western European interpretation of exotic stories, like Asian stories. And so this idea that opera is becoming a medium that other cultures can tell their own authentic stories through was really interesting to me. And I was pretty committed to not making a hybrid opera, like a hyphenated opera. Because when I looked for it, I was like, okay, black opera. and of course from the performing standpoint, I mean, we have this incredible lineage of performers in this from, Leontine Price and William Warfield and Jesse Norman and, I mean, sort of Marian Anderson, I mean, all of these performers, but from an authorship standpoint, from a sense of like actually being able to tell our stories from our own perspective, I needed to find some way to sort of see that happening. There was the Dean of African American Composers, William Grant Still, wrote six operas, I think. Only one of them had a performance in New York, and it was panned by the New York critics specifically because they did not want to advance the idea that an African American was capable of writing opera. They did not want to open that door to African American stories, and so I was like, so reading his journey and sort of bringing that to opera. I mean, that gave me sort of the idea that I could belong here. If William Grant Still could do this, then I mean, I played some of his music, I've studied his music. Then that is permission for me to explore it. But then, how do I then bring who I am, not sort of have to write an opera in a language that is not my own? I mean, I studied classical music. I mean, I played it my whole entire life. So there is a deep love of that. But the jazz culture and the jazz music and the sort of vernacular music of my cultural background, I wanted to be able to bring that in, and I didn't really see it. And I started talking to some of my peers, Esperanza Spalding is working on the libretto for Wayne Shorter's opera, so we talked about opera. Trumpeter Terrence Blanchard just had his premiere, Champion, his first opera premiere. His second one is going to be going up at the Met in a couple of years. And so I talked to Terrence about that. It's like, okay, and I listened to their work, and it's like, okay, I see these entry points in it. It just took enough evidence that it was possible that I'd said, okay, I'm ready to throw my hat in the ring.
Could we talk about that in relationship to the African American community here in Portland? This idea of how something being present could give you enough information, enough evidence to sort of validate your existence, right. Or to validate the possibilities of what you might be able to accomplish through art in terms of connecting community. Mm-hmm. I know in earlier conversations you and I have kind of batted around this idea of what does it mean to be an academic and in an African American body living in a city like Portland, right. with the particular demographic statistics that it has. Right. How does that connect us or disconnect us from our broader community, the communities we work within, for, because of? I'm really interested in how those ideas became important within this opera and what potential you think Sanctuaries has to kind of contribute to these ways in which we might more deeply connect as African Americans in this community.
Man, you asked long questions.
I'm sorry, I know.
It started from an interest in the history, right? So I mean, for me, our art, the opportunity to tell stories in art is an opportunity to investigate things that I want to know more about, things that I feel like should be better known. And so, if you are going to write a story about gentrification in Portland, which is an issue that impacts not just the African American community, but it impacts all communities. I start to look at, well, what are the causes for that, and what is the history for that? And what was so interesting about this is that I thought, everybody talks about gentrification, although there are many people who, I think maybe now, because it's been 2.5, 3 years, a broader base of people would know what the word gentrification actually meant. And because it's been said so much in the past 3 years, they don't have that sort of the same innocent connotation about it. A lot of the sort of roots of what causes gentrification have become more exposed as we've had more and more conversations about it. But in the beginning, people didn't even know, gentrification, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? That was the conversation. And then in looking at the impacts of gentrification on the Black community, you start to look at, well, what's happening now, like when you go to Mississippi Avenue or when you go to Williams Avenue, is just the tip of an iceberg of systemic discrimination and disinvestment in African American communities that goes way, way, way down. And you trace it back through these incidents of, the Emmanuel Hospital expansion and the sort of demolishing of the Black community in that, the putting in of I-5 and the Minnesota Highway and the demolishing of the Black community of that. But then you sort of, okay, that's good, we get that, we understand that. And then we look back further and we start to see that, okay, these were the personal incidences in Portland or Oregon that caused this, but then you look back to the Fair Housing Act, and you realize that African Americans could not get FHA loans, or VA loans, right? It's like,
Loans.
oh, let's dig further back than that. And so you start to see what you started looking at as like this, oh, gentrification, it's a really bad thing. It's like, wait, and then urban renewal and this idea of, deliberate disinvestment in communities to bring the property values down to the point where they could be purchased and then revitalized, right? And so I started to see all of that, and that becomes inspiring thematic material. And so there's opportunities for that information to spread, right? There are a lot of people that those stories to be told, that history to be told and welcomed, as opposed to flattened down and denied, right? That didn't happen. We didn't do that. I mean, that's not what happened in Portland. But the interesting thing is when we make art, I have this I don't know who made the quote, but this quote that I've been sort of circulating in my mind a lot is that, art does not change the world, but art is able to give people a perspective that allows them to change the world, right? And so when I think about, if I want my art to be sort of informing that new perspective, one of the ways I can do that is to use it didactically, to try and teach the sort of population members of the population who are interested, who are in the power and privileged position, to give them new information and sort of help them to change. And so there's that lens, but then the other possibility is not to do that with the art. And that's where I feel like Sanctuaries has come. It's like, how do I tell this story not to sort of teach, not as a teaching thing for white communities, but how do I tell this story as an empowering narrative of resilience and validation for the Black community? And so thinking about that in the art has informed everything I do. So that despite the fact, I'm going to use the fact that I'm a classically trained musician, that I've studied Brahms and Schubert and I love chamber music and writing counterpoint, but what if I invest all that education and energy into musical themes that come from the Black vernacular, right? And what if I sort of deliberately try and confound expectations by not following those threads in the way that I was taught in the sort of Western, in my Westernized musical education, but rather bring them into the ways that I was taught in my jazz education. And so that also goes for audience, right? So what does it mean in Portland, one of the whitest cities in America, one of the most gentrified cities in America, with one of the smallest Black populations, for very deliberate and systemic and sort of long-term reasons? What would it mean to shape my entire process of this piece so that the African American community in this city felt ownership of a piece of art that draws so much, that draws its name, opera, from the Western European canon? Like, what would it take for me to create a piece that the African American community which inspired this piece, which it is about, which it is for, feels such ownership of it that it's like, no, this is our opera, and everybody can come to it. It's celebrate. It's like it's open to everyone, and I feel like it's valuable to everyone. But how do we center that idea that this is a piece of culture that is for and about and directed at African Americans? So that's as much of a challenge as writing the opera. That's as interesting to me as writing the opera. It's like trying to figure out how do we do that, and in doing that and in seeing that witnessed, that's liberating for every single person that lives in Portland, because that's the world that we actually want, even if we don't know it. We want a world where communities of color are thriving and empowered and feel good. And the process of holding on to oppression, of keeping the privilege in place, is draining so much energy from everybody in the community, like sort of letting go of it, even though it's fearful. I was talking about this with somebody the other day. Even though it's scary to let go of some of the privilege, the energy released from not having to protect it and seeing others thrive is a greater victory. Like that gives us so much more. What we lose, what some people might fear they lose in terms of privilege, will be more than sort of compensated for by the additional humanity that we all gain.
When I think about this work, this project Sanctuaries, the name is really compelling, right? It recalls me to ideas about safety and home. But as an artist, I'm also really interested in how you might think about site specificity, right? Like how your project relates or is informed by, and how there's kind of a back and forth between where it's taking place and how the project is taking shape.
Right.
So I'm curious, over the course of time or in the process of making the work, what kind of dialogues did you find yourself having with Portland, if you will, or with how did they manifest in the characters in Sanctuary?
So first of all, we cited in the community. Like the performance is at this place called North Warehouse, which is not far. It's right near the river, and but it's it's sort of in. I mean, it's Albina. The historic city of Albina was larger than the neighborhood of Albina that we talk about, but it's within that sort of district, that black community. So we cite it there. So then the performers, the four singers who are coming, are returning to this space, are actually black people returning to the space where they used to live. And the audience, which is, whoever the audience is also returning to this neighborhood that was once a black neighborhood to experience an opera that sort of is about the return, is about this sort of dispossession and the diaspora of people from this neighborhood and its impact on sort of the black community and black bodies and the wound that we all carry, from this sort of dispossession. So for instance, here's an interesting choice. This warehouse, I think they built ships there, they build boats there, and it's old, but now they use it for, movie shoots and weddings and stuff like that. So it has been updated, right? Because it's a commercial space, so they have this really nice entrance. That's the gentrified entrance. So what if we don't have the audience come through the gentrified entrance to the building? What if, and that like thinking about the specific, how to use the site, even at that detailed way, so the audience goes through like the entrance that really reflects the nature of the building's connection to the community, as opposed to the one that's been plopped on it to make it used to the sort of middle class or upper middle class ambiance that we're used to. So all of those things become things that you can think about, the experience of how the space is set up so that the actors and the singers are actually moving through the audience, and it's more has the feeling of either a sanctuary or a ship. I mean, those are two metaphors that we use in the piece, and so all of that becomes a possibility to create an experience that people can reflect on. That's not just passively sitting watching people perform on a stage.
How do you think about the audience's role in relationship to this work? Because the audience will change. So I know there's a desire to have an audience that deeply reflects the neighborhood, maybe almost exclusively at some point during the run of the performance. But then also it is open to anybody to come. And there is a potential for the opera, in my mind, to sort of be very alive in that way. And that it's not just a continual reproduction, although there are repeated components that who's there might shift it.
That's true, but then there are also changing components. So the nature of how we set this up in terms of cast is that there are four speaking characters, singing/speaking characters, but there are actually three singing characters. There's the character of the returner, who is this woman who's embodies the people who came from the neighborhood but lost it and want to come back. There's the character of the reverend, who sort of embodies this idea of the person who still has a footprint in the community, but since the population has changed so much, they're trying to figure out what is the meaning. Like, there's a line in the opera, what is a ship if no one's on board? This reverend is like, do I maintain my presence in this community? Do I go to where the people have gone? Or so there's that character. There's a character called the artist, who is sort of someone who's sort of fluidly working through identity and trying to figure out their responsibility to hold the community together, to express the community, whether or not they have enough, because as you know, we artists are sort of fluid in languages, and sort of we move in and out of different cultures, and so how does one serve as an artist to a community, in a community that is lost and is trying to come back together? And then this last character, so those are all singing characters, and then the last character, Carpenter, is my librettist pulled him, this brilliant poet, Anis, but he was saying, in New Orleans, there were all these people that used to wander in the neighborhood, and we never knew their actual names. Like they were somebody's cousin or something. They were, and I was thinking, okay, so here we have this dramatic sort of structure of opera where there are protagonists and all the characters have agency. They all have purpose, but that's not the nature of what it's like to be in a community like this. There are plenty of people that you pass on the street that sit in front of the barbershop. They don't have agency, and so we thought really important to represent that sort of character in the piece. And so there's this character called Carpenter who is sort of this wanderer who also has a wound but doesn't have the sense of agency, purpose, connection to the community. And so expressing that, and that is a speaking role, that's a spoken word role. So Anis is a performing poet. And so that's the sensibility that he brings to writing his first opera libretto. The language is unbelievable in this thing. And so having somebody whose role in the opera is, because opera typically doesn't have spoken word. Opera, one of the ways to define opera is that it's sung throughout, as opposed to a musical that has spoken text and sung text. But to have that and say, no, we're going to actually incorporate this sort of vernacular tradition of African American speech, that's one of the ways in which we claim this opera as, as an African American form of expression. And so there's that, there's the way that those interact as well.
I'm thinking that potentially even the way that we define what singing is might be
exactly, and that was another way in, because it was like, do they have to sound like opera singers? Is it an opera? So then I started looking at other cultures, Spanish opera, tonadilla, I think it's called. This is like Spanish Portuguese operatic tradition. And I started looking at contemporary, like 20th century opera, Berg and Schoenberg and Webern. And it's like, okay, then there's this technique called Sprechstimme, which is the German, it's called speech singing, right? And it's like pitchless, and it's like all this. And I happen to be on the board of an organization with a woman who is like one of the leading famous practitioners of that. And so she, talking to her, gave me the courage to say, well, what's the difference between that and scat singing? Oh, there isn't any. Okay, well now scat singing becomes something that you can draw on the operatic tradition. Okay, fantastic. So
this really, it's so exciting. I can't wait. It's living in my imagination now in a way that I cannot wait to experience it, and it's coming soon.
I mean, part of the other thing about doing this opera in Portland is that it's about the city, it's for this city, and so it gives us an opportunity to amplify conversations that are already going on about how to make this city something different than it is becoming. If we don't want gentrification, what are the alternatives? And I hope that Sanctuaries becomes just an occasion to sort of move those conversations further along about, well, how might we do it differently? Transportation, how might we do housing differently? How might we do, racial equity differently in order to come to something different than what is the inevitable result of this gentrification in every city in America, sort of sucking the life of cultures, displacing people, erasing communities, erasing, I mean, we have to be able to do something better than that.
Thank you so much, Darrell. It's a pleasure always to talk
great
with
to talk
you.
to you. My colleague, shall we shake it?
Let's, yeah.